Morning, folks, and welcome to today's episode called Sir James Goldsmith, From Corporate Raiding to Political Crusading. Here's a guy who won the equivalent of £350,000 on a horse race when he was just 16 years old. He made international headlines at 21 for eloping with the daughter of one of the world's richest men. He employed 400 people by the time he was 23, and he went on to become one of the most ruthless, cunning and well-known corporate raiders in the US during the 1980s. And then he emerged in the 90s as one of the most prominent anti-globalization and anti-EU voices, helping to lay the foundation for what would become Brexit. And all the while, publicly juggling his time between his ex-wife, his current wife, and his mistress. It's a cracking story. Enjoy. So James Goldsmith, or Jimmy as he preferred to be called, he was born in Paris on the 26th of February 1933 into the Goldsmith dynasty. It was a family of wealthy merchant bankers with roots intermarried with the Rothschilds. And his father, Major Frank Goldsmith, he was an Oxford-educated ex-MP who moved to France, and he ended up running luxury hotels in Paris, Cannes and other French cities. So Jimmy grew up amid, yachts, limousines, casinos, a pretty rarefied world in pre-war European high society. Now, when the Nazi forces overrun France in June 1940, the family escaped on one of the last boats out of Bayonne, and Frank, his father, loses much of his wealth as a result of this, but the family are from a very wealthy background anyway. So they find refuge in the Bahamas initially, and then by the late 40s, they've returned to England, and young Goldsmith, he goes to school at Eton, where he's remembered as this restless, self-assured young man, and much more interested in gambling than in books, because he was a gambler from a very young age. And at 16, he bets £10 on a long shot 3-horse accumulator and wins about £8,000. That's the equivalent of £350,000 in today's money. A fortune for a schoolboy, or for anyone else really for that matter back then, because back then that would have bought you about 3 or 4 standard houses. Now, with his new fortune, Goldsmith announces his departure from Eton. Remember, he's just 16, by saying to the headmaster, "A man of my means should not remain a schoolboy." And so he hires a car, drives straight to London, where he lives for 2 years, accumulating significant gambling debts that his father has to pay off. At 18, he goes into national service. It's compulsory back then. And by the time he leaves the army, he's impatient. He wants to build an enterprise. So he joins his brother Teddy in Paris, because Teddy has started up this very, very small pharmaceutical business called Laboratoire Dagonel. And it's not going well. So young Goldsmith persuades his brother Teddy to hand him the reins. And with his trademark energy and confidence, because Goldsmith has a ton of both, he restructures swiftly. He innovates a direct-to-wholesaler distribution model, and in 1956 he pioneers low-cost generic drugs in Europe, and the workforce expands from 2 employees to over 400. He does all this by the age of just 23. Now, while this is going on, his personal life makes the headlines, and for Goldsmith, his personal life really stays in the headlines throughout his lifetime. So in 1953, when he moved over to Paris, he fell in love with Maria Isabel Patino. She's a 17-year-old Bolivian heiress and the daughter of the tin baron Don Antenor Patino, one of the world's richest men at the time. When Goldsmith approached Don Antenor and asked for permission to marry his daughter, he reportedly sneered at Goldsmith and said, "We come from a Catholic family. It is not our habit to marry Jews." And he sent his daughter to North Africa under guard. Goldsmith charters a private plane and pursues her. In January 1954, the couple eloped to Scotland, and for 3 weeks they hide. And the story becomes a news sensation. The tabloid press call them the Playboy and the heiress. It's all over the press. And a furious Don Antenor drags them to court seeking to annul the marriage, but he loses. By spring of 1954, Isabel was 7 months pregnant when she collapsed from cerebral hemorrhage. An emergency caesarean delivers the baby girl alive, but the young mother dies, and apparently Goldsmith is devastated. He flees to West Africa to grieve, but also to escape the press. And in his absence, the Patino family abducts his young daughter from her nursery, and upon returning, Goldsmith fights back through the courts, regains custody, but the loss of his young wife had a huge impact on him, and he could never bring himself to talk about her throughout his life. And friends noticed that he became very withdrawn for many years and threw himself into work. So by the mid-1950s, the rapid expansion of the pharmaceutical company in France, it's come at a cost because it's grossly undercapitalised and overextended. And on July 10th, 1957, Goldsmith's creditors were set to push the company into bankruptcy when fate pretty much dramatically intervenes, because in an almost unbelievable stroke of luck, all of the banks in Paris suddenly go on a 6-week general strike that very day, and the shutdown freezes the financial system, preventing creditors from collecting immediately. Here's a quote from Goldsmith. He said, "It was the most astounding and unexpected bit of luck I have ever had in my whole career." So Goldsmith, of course, seizes this unexpected lifeline, and working his butt off during the hiatus, he negotiates a deal to sell off the pharmaceutical business before it can collapse. He gets about £120,000 in cash. That's over about £3.5 million in today's money, plus a generous ongoing royalty of roughly £4,000 per month, about £120,000 a month. So, flush with cash, he gets involved in various businesses, and all of them, they demonstrate his ability to spot emerging trends. So he sets up the mother care chain aimed at the booming baby and maternity market. He gets into slimming and tanning products that become huge hits. And then in 1965, he makes his big move into the food and grocery business. So with the backing of a guy called Sir Isaac Wolfson, he was a prominent retail tycoon in the UK. Goldsmith, he buys up a series of small food companies and floats them on the London Stock Exchange as Cavenham Foods. And it's a patchwork of businesses with about £27 million in annual turnover, but barely any profit at all. Goldsmith closes inefficient factories, overhauls sleepy management teams, and revenues rise and the business becomes profitable. So at the end of the 60s, at just 36, Goldsmith is one of Britain's most talked about young businessmen. And then in 1971, he launched a really bold bid for Bovril. This was a venerable but underperforming British foods company, more than twice the size of his own business. And the takeover, of course, was fiercely contested. London's financial press, they attacked Goldsmith as a raider, predicting that he would asset strip the beloved brands that Bovril had, including Bovril, Marmite, Ambrosia, and a lot of traditional bankers in the city. They didn't like him at all. They saw him as this young upstart. And this is the thing about Goldsmith. He was always an outsider, always viewed with suspicion by parts of the British elite. And that's because he didn't play by their rules, and he liked unsettling the establishment. Anyway, Goldsmith prevailed with a £14.5 million bid, about £270 million in today's money. He later called it the most important deal of his life, and it was, because this deal, it underscored Goldsmith's MO, his ability to spot where the true value lies. John Tigret was a very well-connected US consultant and investor who worked with everyone from the Gettys to Arm & Hammer, and later worked with Goldsmith in the US, and he pinpointed Goldsmith's superpower, and I quote, "He has the best financial mind I know of. He can take a balance sheet and read it and tell you what is wrong with a company. He incorporates that ability with the ability to operate a company." So with Bovril, Goldsmith sold off the dairy farms, the milk operations, Bovril's cattle ranches in Argentina, recouping nearly all of the purchase cost within months, while still holding on to the brands like Bovril, Marmite and Ambrosia, which he would later sell to realise a huge profit. The Sunday Times called him a combination of financial Houdini and commercial master builder. Now, as the markets moved towards the 1973-74 crisis, Goldsmith quietly liquidated a lot of his UK assets, and then he stunned the business world by revealing that he had acquired a controlling stake in Grand Union, one of America's oldest supermarket chains, for around $64 million. Again, he slashed underperforming divisions, divesting non-food businesses, shutting down unprofitable outlets. He faced intense pushback in the US. Unions staged protests. The media dubbed him the Red Raider, but he prevailed and eventually sold the retailer in the 80s for a huge return on investment. But getting back to the 70s, in 1976, Goldsmith was embroiled in a high-profile feud with the British press. Private Eye, it's this political satire magazine, they had published a story falsely implicating Goldsmith in a conspiracy to hide Lord Lucan. He's that fugitive aristocrat who's wanted for murder and who's never been found. So enraged, Goldsmith launched an all-out legal offensive. Like, he really went over the top, I think, slapping Private Eye's editor and a reporter with 63 libel lawsuits because he was determined to wipe them out financially. Now, Private Eye eventually settled, agreeing to pay him £30,000 in damages and to buy a full-page ad in the Evening Standard admitting that there was not a shred of truth to the various libels. But the British media, they closed ranks against Goldsmith. They portrayed him as a thin-skinned bully, abusing his wealth to silence criticism. And Fleet Street continued to lampoon him as a bombastic upstart and an asset stripper in business throughout most of his life. Now, publicly, of course, Goldsmith fought against this characterisation, and in a heated BBC interview he insisted that when he dismantled the company's parts, it was to kill off bureaucracy and free underlying businesses to flourish, not to kill jobs, wantonly. But this perception of Goldsmith as a villain was so pervasive at this time that it's claimed that Hugo Drax, the antagonist in the James Bond movie Moonraker, which was released in 1979, is widely believed to have been shaped in part by Goldsmith, a wealthy outsider, tolerated by the establishment but never fully accepted, operating in strategic industries and viewed with suspicion. Now, at the start of the 80s, Goldsmith relocated to New York because he was motivated by a belief that the US markets were undervaluing assets, particularly natural resources. So he homed in on a quirk, because Goldsmith saw that the underlying value of timber alone in some companies was worth more than the entire market capitalization of those firms. So in 1981, Goldsmith bought Diamond International, a century-old paper and packaging conglomerate with extensive timberlands. He bought it for $660 million. Over the next 12 months, he sells off the pulp, paper mills, packaging plants, consumer divisions, raising approximately $587 million, clearing most of Diamond's acquisition debt in one fell swoop. And crucially, he retained Diamond's vast timberlands, which had been undervalued on the books, and by 1983, those forests were valued at $720 million. So in total, Goldsmith netted about a $647 million profit within 2 years. Now, critics lamented the loss of a storied company and the layoffs. Labour unions accused Goldsmith of caring only for paper profits. Goldsmith was unfazed. He argued that Diamond had been mismanaged into the ground. And the Diamond coup, it really established Goldsmith among the era's top corporate raiders in the US, alongside the likes of T. Boone Pickens and Carl Icahn. Now, these corporate raiders also earned another nickname, Greenmailers, and this was because their reputation alone, it was enough that if they bought shares in a company, the stock price, of course, would surge as markets anticipated a takeover battle, and often the target companies would then pay these raiders a premium to buy back their shares and just to go away, essentially, paying them off to avoid the disruption of a hostile takeover. And the raiders would pocket a massive profit without ever actually taking control or doing anything much really except buying a few shares at the start. And while Goldsmith insisted that he wasn't a greenmailer, he definitely benefited in the same way that greenmailers did. For example, in early 1984, he quietly accumulated shares of St. Regis Corporation, a $2.8 billion forest products conglomerate. And after contentious discussions, Goldsmith abruptly withdrew and sold his stake, held for barely a month, and made $51 million in profit. Weeks later, he made a $2 billion offer for the Continental Group. Continental accepted a rival buyout, leaving Goldsmith with $35 million in profits. In 1985, he went after Crown Zellerbeck. This was this storied San Francisco-based forest products company, and this turned into an epic 8-month battle. So I do think he was pretty serious maybe about taking them over. I think it's not true to say that these raiders went after every company with a view to just remailing them. But I think they kind of went in going, I'll give this a go and then see how it goes. The worst that can happen is I'll make a bit of money and back out. Anyway, in Crown Zellerbeck, the management had recently adopted a novel poison pill defence. This was a mechanism that would automatically dilute a raider's shares if they crossed a certain ownership threshold, making it, prohibitively expensive to continue with the takeover. But Goldsmith was undeterred. He breached the 20% threshold, triggering the poison pill, and rather than backing off, he pressed on even harder. Crown owned nearly 2 million acres of prime timberland, valued at a trivial amount on their books, and that's what Goldsmith wanted. So, after 8 months, they eventually negotiated a deal. Goldsmith sold his Crown shares back in exchange for 1.6 million acres of forest, the packaging division, and 90 million in cash. It's estimated that he made about a 440 million profit from that deal. Now, while all of that deal making and corporate raiding was going on, it's worth taking a little time out to explain Goldsmith's pretty unusual personal life. Because, you see, for a lot of people, Goldsmith's personal life was far more interesting than his business life. And it's easy to see why. I already mentioned that his first wife died in 1954 at the age of 18, leaving Goldsmith a widower with a baby daughter. Well, in 1958, Goldsmith married his former secretary, Jeanette Leary. They had 2 children together. In 1964, while still married to Jeanette, he began a high-profile and very public affair with Lady Annabel Vane Tempest Stewart. Now that's some name. She was, at that time, the wife of Mark Burley, who owned Annabel's, the famous Mayfair nightclub named after her. Goldsmith and Lady Annabel had 2 children during this very public affair. In 1978, they both divorced their respective partners and married each other, and they had a 3rd child. But Goldsmith remained on very friendly terms with Jeanette Leary, and she lived on his Mexican estate, and they continued to co-parent. And after marrying Lady Annabel, Goldsmith then started a relationship with French journalist Laura Boulet de la Meurthe, the granddaughter of a Bourbon princess. As Goldsmith quipped, when one marries one's mistress, one creates a vacancy. And though he never married Laura, he openly acknowledged her as a partner, and together they had 2 children. Now, Goldsmith's wives, partners and children were of course aware of one another. Everyone was. Former partners remained on amicable terms, children were publicly recognised, and conflict was managed through separation rather than secrecy. And while it might seem chaotic to those looking in, and to me, and it's definitely unorthodox, apparently there was stability, and this became most visible in Goldsmith's final years when the different branches of the family came together without any infighting. But despite how well Goldsmith managed to normalise this family life, the fact that he had these different families and the openness with which he moved between his various families, it of course remained a huge curiosity for the public. Anyway, back to business. In autumn 1986, Goldsmith set his sights on his most ambitious target yet, Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, the world's largest tire manufacturer at that time. He quietly bought 11.5% of the company. On the 5th of November 1986, he informed Goodyear CEO that he intended to launch a $5.3 billion hostile bid for the entire company. Within days, Goodyear launched a blistering counteroffensive, announcing a dramatic restructuring plan. Now, at the same time, the company orchestrated a public campaign, painting Goldsmith, as this foreign predator. Politicians from Ohio to Washington spoke out against the raid. Goldsmith was once again demonised in the press. Now, of course, his interest in the company sent the stock price soaring, and after just 3 weeks of this very public onslaught, Goldsmith agreed to sell his entire stake back to the company but he netted a $95 million profit in just 2 months by doing so. I mean, was this just a very simple, quick example of how profitable Greenmail was? Who can say really? But a year later, Goldsmith did point out that Goodyear's subsequent actions were almost exactly what he had proposed in his restructuring plan. So by mid-1987, with the markets booming, Goldsmith's spider senses, I suppose, were tingling, and he made one of the shrewdest moves of his career and of any business person at that time, because he liquidated the bulk of his investment portfolio, quietly selling off assets not core to his timber holdings and converting them into cash. For example, since the 1970s, he had held a stake in the French conglomerate General Occidental, and it was involved in insurance, finance, media, and he sold that stake, netting $450 million. He sold the Grand Union Retail Group for roughly $1.3 billion, which is a pretty good return on his initial $64 million investment back in the 70s. And then, on the 19th of October 1987, Black Monday, the stock market crashed, and Goldsmith was largely unscathed. His timing had been perfect. A few weeks after this, Time magazine put him on its cover with the headline, "The Lucky Gambler." And so, at only 54, he said he was retiring to his estate in Mexico, telling friends he was weary of the corporate circus. But, of course, a person with his kind of energy, confidence, brashness, he's not likely to stay retired. However, it appears that the time away from finance did result in a period of reflection, because Goldsmith entered the 1990s very pessimistic on Western financial systems and hostile to the emerging global economic order. In 1990, he traded his American timber assets, which he had still held onto. He didn't sell those before the 1987 crash. So he sold them for a 49.9% stake in the gold mining company Newmont Mining. He held the position for 3 years, and then in 1993, he sold his stake to George Soros and other investors, converting his holdings into just over $1 billion in cash. So now, with a fortune estimated at somewhere between $2 to $3 billion, he was going to invest some of it, along with his intellect and his energy, into this fight against globalization. Now, for context, around these times, we had the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. That moved Europe from a common market of trading partners to the European Union with a single currency, which in turn led to the introduction of the euro in 1999. Also, from 1986 to 1994, you had negotiations around GATT, which stood for the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And this was opening up a borderless global economy. And Goldsmith was opposed to both of these political/economic movements because he identified both as being part of the same push towards globalization. And the man who had made his fortune in the free market was now turning against it for two reasons. He believed that globalization was having a hugely negative societal impact in developed and developing countries, and he believed that globalization was a threat to national sovereignty. So, in late 1983, Goldsmith wrote a book called Le Piège, or The Trap, in France, where he argued that integrating these vast low-wage labour pools from developing countries, like China, India, Vietnam, into the Western trading system would lead to social catastrophe. Western corporations would inevitably and quickly move all their production to low-cost jurisdictions, leaving Western workers unemployed, while upending, I suppose, social structures in developing countries as rural agriculture workers moved into impoverished cities that lacked the infrastructure to cater for them. So Goldsmith believed that the scale of this change was unprecedented and the results would be imminent and disastrous. There's a certain irony and definite hypocrisy in Goldsmith's position, because the same man who had defended his own business practices of closing down factories, letting people go, having a massive and negative impact on the communities where those workers were now unemployed, all on the basis that it was good for business, that it needed to be done, was now turning around and saying that companies shouldn't be allowed to move their factories wherever they wanted because of the negative impact it would have on the local communities. So I watched Goldsmith debate GATT on Charlie Rose with Laura Tyson. You can watch it on YouTube. Laura Tyson was chair of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. Now, Goldsmith makes points that sound convincing, but my take is that his argument is oversimplified. And look, while he is definitely very engaging, also very polite and very passionate, I found myself siding with Tyson, who I thought had a more nuanced understanding of macroeconomics. And look, I'm not an economist, but that's my take on it. Also, Goldsmith portrayed globalization as leading to imminent economic and social collapse, a case that proved too severe in its timing and its tone. He was too alarmist. Now look, I'm not saying that Goldsmith was totally wrong, nor am I saying that globalization has been 100% successful. I mean, far from it. It created pressures he warned about, like wage stagnation, weakened labour bargaining, regional decline. But globalization has also lowered prices. It's raised living standards. It has helped move an estimated 1.2 billion out of extreme poverty. So that's not a marginal effect. That's one of the largest improvements in human welfare in recorded history. Now, Goldsmith's next political fight was with Europe. In 1994, he was elected to the European Parliament representing a French constituency, and he also launched the Referendum Party in the UK. And the party had one single objective: to force a referendum on the UK's relationship with the EU. Now, I think it's important to note that Goldsmith wasn't as anti-European as many commentators make him out to be. He was culturally European himself. Like, he was born in France. He lived in France. He spoke fluent French. He also lived in Spain and in Britain and, of course, Mexico. But he was opposed to what he saw as a system that was gradually removing power from voters. To Goldsmith, the referendum was about restoring democratic choice, but also, of course, about maintaining national sovereignty. And despite having plenty of money, the Referendum Party was really disorganised. It was basically a one-man band. And in the 1997 general election, the party failed to win a single seat. But its strategic impact has been significant. Goldsmith didn't create the Tory Eurosceptic movement. That had already been well underway. But his involvement added pressure onto the Tories to become even more Eurosceptic. So you can definitely make the case that Goldsmith and his Referendum Party laid the groundwork for what became Brexit. And look, I'm not totally against everything Goldsmith stood for in relation to the EU. I do think we need some sort of guardrails to prevent the EU becoming this remote, bureaucratic megastate where voters come to believe they have very little choice or say in how decisions are made. Because, when voters become disenfranchised, we see the emergence of populist movements that draw their support on pro-nationalist rhetoric. And it's that type of politics that I believe is really dangerous. Because I'm pro-EU. The raison d'etre of the EU was to prevent war. And given that we haven't had a world war in over 80 years, and the last two world wars were caused by Europe, I'd say the EU is working, despite its many flaws. And I do think we need to make Brussels more accountable, and the people need to see it and to feel it. Anyway, that's my rant over with. Apologies, listeners. Let's get back to Goldsmith. During the 1997 general election, while Goldsmith projected this image of a tireless warrior, he was actually fighting a private battle because he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 1993, and he kept his illness a total secret because he was afraid that the Referendum Party would be dismissed as a dying man's vanity project. By 1996, though, the cancer had returned aggressively, and after the election, Goldsmith's body more or less collapsed, and he retreated to his Spanish estate, where he died on the 18th of July 1997 at the age of 64, with his extended family gathered round him. So, where do I stand on James Goldsmith? I don't agree with his politics at all, but I don't have any problem with him holding different political views. Democracies need different views. But I am really confused about where these views came from. He was a very astute businessman with a global perspective. He was a globalist in every way. So I can't figure out why he focused only on the negatives and wouldn't even acknowledge the positives that came with a more globalised economy. And fighting for the UK to maintain its national sovereignty, Here's a guy who never cared about national sovereignty for the first 60 years of his life. He lived in the UK, yes, but he also lived in France and Mexico and Spain. Why all of a sudden was he interested in the UK's sovereignty? I find that curious, I suppose, to say the least. Can it be put down to the fact that, as many people have said, he was purely anti-establishment, that he was hardwired to go against the grain? I don't know. But despite me being confused as to where he was coming from politically, I've always admired Goldsmith. I've admired his individuality, his fantastic business brain, the risks he took. Now, it's hard to get a feel for the man himself because he was very much, I think, a comedian. But what an extraordinary life, and what a great business story. And with that, we come to listeners' emails. And this one comes from Sean, who would love to hear some stories on the robber barons from the 1880s in the US. Great call, Sean, and I actually have a fantastic story lined up involving one of the robber barons. Thanks for listening, Sean, and for the suggestion. And remember, if you have any comments, any questions, or any story that you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.